Hey there and welcome back. This is Felix from Gold Vintage Watches. Fortunately, there's never a dull day because there are always interesting stories to tell about vintage watches. Today we are talking about a watch manufacturer who sold his watches in the 20th century under three different names: Jaeger LeCoultre and Jaeger only. If you follow our channel closely, you already know the story behind LeCoultre only dials and the connection with the US market from the 1930s to the 70s and the avoidance of import taxes. Now we would like to join the story behind Jaeger only dials. So enjoy the intro before we dive into this exciting topic. Nowadays, we all know how important marketing and brand recognition are to make a company successful. So, from today's perspective, one question immediately arises. Why the hell would you stamp a different name on your dial? Or even, as in this case, just parts of the name? On Jaeger LeCoultre, as mentioned, we find both simplified signatures, just Jaeger and LeCoultre. Long story short, Jaeger LeCoultre marked its chronographs for the French domestic market only with Jaeger, and as already mentioned, LeCoultre for the American US market. A look at the history of the brand shows that it was originally founded in 1833 by Monsieur Antoine LeCoultre in a small farmhouse in Switzerland. No Jaeger in sight yet. The name Jaeger, in form of Monsieur Edmund Jaeger, did not come into play until 70 years later in 1903. In fact, in the early days, LeCoultre mainly produced movements, but not complete watches. Edmund Jaeger, however, was a Parisian watchmaker, and not just any watchmaker. He was designated a state-appointed watchmaker. In other words, he was one of the most influential figures in the French watchmaking world, and thus LeCoultre's ticket to the great world of watchmaking. LeCoultre was beginning to finally become an independent watch brand. And yes, it was still LeCoultre. Jaeger and LeCoultre jointly released the same watches under their respective names until 1937. More than 30 years after they began working together, they finally merged into a single company. Nevertheless, the pure Jaeger stamped watches did not completely disappear after 1937. In fact, you can see watches and mechanical instruments with the Jaeger signature well into the 1980s, even though chronograph watches were the most common until the 1950s. For example, here you can see a vintage 1930s advertisement for Jaeger aeronautical instruments. The reason for this, to some degree, is still the brand's recognition value. People know LeCoultre and Jaeger watches, but the Maison was still reserved to use both names at the same time. So Edmund Jaeger was a famous and renowned watchmaker. Working with Cartier & Co., he and his brand were very well suited to sell in the French market. A win-win situation to keep the name going. But it's a bit more complicated than that, of course. France, like many other countries, had high import duties on certain goods at the time, which included watches. Therefore, manufacturing in France was a great financial advantage for the French market. But this is not the end of the collaboration. At the heart of these chronograph watches ticks not a Jaeger LeCoultre movement, but arguably one of the most important chronograph movements of the last century: the Universal Geneve caliber 285, which was introduced in 1932. The first chronograph wristwatch with two pushers and two subdials. The modern chronograph layout, if you will. The Jaeger stamp and the caliber 285 stamp just below it are clearly visible in this movement. However, Universal Geneve may not have been the source of this movement at all. The lore is that a small company called Martel developed the technology. The caliber 749 was an invention that was passed on to Universal Geneve and thus to Jaeger. Interestingly, Venice was probably involved in the conception of all these movements. and eventually bought Martel in 1958. So we've established that Jaeger watches primarily made for the French domestic market, right? Well, if we take a closer look at the ad I shown you before, we can spot a very interesting little detail at the bottom of this ad. The same Jaeger aeronautical timepieces, 1938 ad as before. If we zoom in on the bottom of the page, we can clearly see how these timepieces were distributed by Jaeger Watch Company in New York City, United States of America. This is indeed a very revealing advertisement, as it proves that Jaeger was definitely used outside of France. A closer look at our today's piece reveals the same international roots. Our Jaeger not only bears a special signature at the top, but also another at the bottom. This timepiece was originally sold by Astura of Turin, Italy, an estimate jewelry and watch dealer since 1860. Overall, we can see that the history of the Jaeger brand is anything but straightforward. But let's put all the pieces of the puzzle together again. Number 1. We have a brand that still existed and produced watches after the merger with LeCoultre in 1937. Number 2. A brand that historically had a good reputation as one of the haute horlogerie manufacturers in France. Number 3. The pieces produced after the merger consisted mainly of mechanical instruments and chronographs, with movements that were not even from their watchmaking partner. And last but not least, number 4, these watches were also exported outside of France and eventually competed with Jaeger LeCoultre watches for an overlapping clientele. In other words, what a piece of watchmaking history. If you ever run out of things to talk about at a watch meeting, wear of these Jaeger timepieces and you'll keep the vintage-hungry crowd entertained for hours. So, that's it for today, and we hope you were able to learn something new. Have a great day and hope to see you in our next video.